Before I talk about my thoughts on Chainsaw Man, I just wanted to say that this video is split into two parts. At first, I'll share my general thoughts without spoilers, and then I'll talk about the whole story and characters. I also won't show any panels from too deep in the story at first, so if you still haven't read or watched Chainsaw Man when the anime finally releases, then this would be a good point to stop the video. Also, I started reading Chainsaw Man a few weeks before the final chapter of part 1 released in the end of 2020, so I thought I better make a video now before the anime could influence my perception of this story. I also haven't started part 2 yet, that released a few weeks ago. I think it's really great that we started to get darker and overall more serious shonen over the last few years, like Chainsaw Man or for example Hell's Paradise or even Jujutsu Kaisen, that try to provide a story with major consequences for each character's actions and can give you the feeling that it maybe won't end so good for every character. These shonen remind me of the Chimera Ant arc in Hunter x Hunter for example, where the story turned more serious and could give you the feeling that these actions had lasting consequences for the characters. That doesn't mean that I automatically prefer these kind of stories to more lighthearted shonen, but I appreciate when a story tells you that its characters are in danger and could potentially die and you actually see some of these things happening. So you keep thinking that something could happen to these characters if they encounter another threat. I think it can really hurt a story if you're constantly told that you should worry about the characters and then they still defeat whatever problem they had to encounter without any real consequences. Of course, I'm not saying that you can't do that, but I think if you still want your audience to feel and or fear for these characters, then you should show them that if the characters are in a deadly situation, they actually can and will die, and I think Chainsaw Man does this really well. I was really invested in most of these characters the whole time and think the feeling that something could happen to them when in danger really helped. But of course, these more serious parts of Chainsaw Man aren't even close to being everything. A huge part of Chainsaw Man is its weirdness and over-the-top characters that can lead to some ridiculous moments that still feel real in its world, but maybe wouldn't work in other stories. I think it's similar in this aspect to something like JoJo, where you have weird moments all the time, but they just work because the story establishes its strange world right from the start, so that no moment, however weird it may be, feels out of place. I mean, Chainsaw Man even starts with Denji talking about how he sold one of his nuts along with other body parts, and then proceeds to kill a tomato devil, so you immediately know that this world is different from ours and will be weird. I think another great aspect that mirrors the serious and weird parts of this story are its main characters. On one hand, you start with Denji, someone that just wants to live a normal life where he can eat anything better than only bread and go out with girls and have fun. Even after he gets the power of the Chainsaw Devil at the end of chapter 1 and meets Makima, his goals stay the same and he tries even harder to achieve them for himself and Pochita. Then you have Power, who basically screams insane and is the most over-the-top character in the story. She is rarely serious and does something ridiculous most of the time. On the other hand, you have a character like Aki, who is very serious and really doesn't want anything to do with Denji or Power at the beginning, and takes his work very seriously. I think the dynamic between these different characters, including Makima, is the most interesting part of Chainsaw Man. Of course, you have these over-the-top action scenes with multiple devils and their vastly different designs that are really cool to read or watch and make up a huge part of Chainsaw Man, but I personally think that the most interesting parts of Chainsaw Man are the interactions between the characters. It also helps that the dialogue feels very different to most shonen, since it's overall more orientated towards an older demographic than most shonen 10 or 15 years ago. I think it's interesting how many shonen over the last few years developed to feel a bit more like seinen than they did years ago. I think another aspect that helps Chainsaw Man to feel different to most shonen is that Denji doesn't have any big goals like you would see them in One Piece or something like Black Clover. He does have goals that he wants to achieve, like I said before, but I think it's really interesting to see a main character who doesn't have these big goals, but instead is just a 16-year-old that wants to have the normal life he couldn't have and touch some boobs. I think it's interesting to see a story where the main character doesn't really want to do these things that he is forced to survive, but instead just has these goals that don't have anything to do with the threats in the world he's living in. I also really like how you can have a story with a main character whose goal is to touch boobs turn into this action-heavy story that still can have serious moments. Before I talk about spoilers, I just wanted to say that Chainsaw Man is really fast-paced and you never have boring moments or moments where not much is happening. When there isn't Denji or someone else fighting against increasingly more dangerous devils, you have very interesting conversations or other moments between characters that help to make these characters more fleshed out. Even if you don't like Chainsaw Man, I don't think you can say that it is boring or its characters aren't memorable. Since Chainsaw Man is very fast-paced and part 1 is only 97 chapters or 11 volumes long, it doesn't take long to read, and I think it's really worth reading or hopefully watching if the anime follows the source material and doesn't do something like Promised Neverland Season 2. I'm going to talk about spoilers now, so if you haven't read Chainsaw Man or watched it when it releases, then I think it's best if you stop the video now. I think one of the most interesting parts of Chainsaw Man is Makima and how you learn more about her over time. When she's introduced, even though she saves Denji and gives him something to eat, you immediately see that she can be ruthless when she says to Denji that if he isn't useful, he will be killed. You constantly see throughout the story that Makima is manipulative towards everyone, especially Denji, and doesn't show her full true self. She always seems to be hiding something, and although she also acts nice towards others by saving them or fulfilling Denji's wishes like going on a date, you know that she hides something from the other characters. And I think the story does that very interestingly by showing increasingly more things over time that hint towards her having a darker side, like devils being afraid of her, or the attack in the train where she gets shot and you see her coming out of the train having killed the attackers and having somehow survived the gunshot. I think when the story makes it clear to the viewer that Makima has some kind of goal that could make her an antagonist is when she meets Kishibe during the Katana Man arc, and he says that he will look the other way no matter what she does, as long as she's on humanity's side. It's very interesting to me that the story makes it clear to the reader that Makima will likely be an antagonist later down the line, only about 30 chapters in a story that's only 97 chapters long. I can't think of another example where a story reveals to the audience that a character will likely betray the others long before the other characters realize it, and it's a major plot point. Most of the time it either happens at the same time where the audience couldn't have known it before, spoilers for Soul Society and Bleach, like the famous example with Aizen where the audience also is surprised, or the audience is given smaller hints and can't figure it out before the characters know it. But I can't think of another example where the audience is told very early on that their character will likely betray the others, and you basically always have this thought in the back of your mind of when and how it will happen. I really like this different approach to the final antagonist and think it leads to some interesting scenes where you can see that Makima clearly has some hidden motivations that she won't tell anyone and how she manipulates others to do what she wants. This also creates a captivating relationship between her and Denji for the readers, because you know that at some point she will likely manipulate him into doing something he doesn't want to, and you can see how even he doesn't fully trust her and questions her personality from time to time. But it's still believable how he does basically anything for her, since from his eyes she is the one who drastically improved his life and let him live as a human-devil hybrid, and even promises him things he always wanted to do. I also like how it's revealed to the other characters that Makima is the control devil, and probably my favorite arc of Chainsaw Man with some of my favorite scenes. I like how the Gun Devil arc concludes Aki's character and think that it is a fitting end from a story viewpoint. He is probably my favorite character and I really like his relationship with Himeno or Denji and Power. I think the story really needs a character like Aki that feels very human and is overall more serious. His relationship with Himeno and how he feels after her death does, in my opinion, give the story something relatable. That not only is very human, but shows a side of the story that isn't all that crazy compared to many of the action scenes and conversations between characters like Power or Denji. Aki has my favorite character development, with how Himeno's death affects him and how this leads to him getting his death foreshadowed by the future devil. The scenes with him, Power and Denji and the Gun Devil arc and the conversation between him and Angel that then leads to Makima's reveal give a good view of how Aki changed from the start of the series and how he doesn't want any more of his partners to die like Himeno did. So I think it's a fitting end that this then leads to him getting killed and possessed by the Gun Devil, and Denji basically getting forced to finally end him in probably my favorite scene with the snowball fight. Another great aspect of this fight, besides the different ways Aki and Denji see it, is how Aki sees Denji crying at his death, contrary to what Denji thought to himself after he noticed Aki crying over Himeno. This then perfectly starts the last arc of part 1 with how Aki's death affects Denji's life and then leads to Power's death. I honestly don't have much to say about the end of the story, or at least the end of part 1 itself, except that it felt a bit rushed to me. I still liked it and I think it's great that after all these hardships, Denji finally has enough meat to eat, but I think the final arc could have been longer, especially the final fight against Makima. I like that the way Denji defeats her is by noticing that she never really cared about him and didn't even recognize him as a person, but only as the Chainsaw Man. But I still feel like that there could have been more. I personally wanted to have at least one more conversation between Makima and Denji, and I also feel like Kubini just disappeared after she met up with Denji and Kishibe. If I had to criticize one point in Chainsaw Man, then that would be its pacing. I think the pacing helps the story to never feel boring since it's moving so fast from one point to another, but I also think that it wouldn't hurt the story to take more time on some plot points. The end of the Gun Devil arc from the point of Makima's reveal as the control devil to Denji killing Aki could have taken a few more chapters. I think this would have helped to show the Gun Devil in its entirety, since it was talked about from very early on in the story up until now, and it was a goal of many characters to finally kill this devil that caused so many deaths. I know that the Gun Devil itself wasn't the focus of this arc, but it would have been nice to see more of it, and more chapters could have also helped to give Aki a more satisfying death, or at least have it be more sad, since I personally think that the story has many sudden deaths like powers, so when you have a death that you know is coming and is also sad, you could give it a bit more time. I feel like the story could really benefit from a few slower moments, or at least a few longer scenes, where they would make sense, or at least I think so. I don't know how fast-paced Fujimoto's earlier big work Fire Punch was, since I've only read one chapter yet, so I don't know if that's just his general writing style, but I think a few more chapters could have helped many moments in the story. I sometimes feel like the story is moving at 1.5 speed, and I really noticed this in the final Arcan fight. You go from Makima being the seemingly undefeatable antagonist to her being defeated, and the story, or at least the story up until part 2 started releasing 1.5 years later, ending in 2 chapters. Only 2 chapters to defeat this antagonist that started building up over most of the story, and what happens with Denji after that. I think it helps that you know that this is only part 1 and you will see Denji and potentially Makima in some form again, but I still wish that it would have been longer, and I only say that because I really like Chainsaw Man and the ideas at the end of the story, but I can't help imagining how it would have looked given more time. I don't know if this was how Fujimoto always imagined the end of this part of the story, but I feel like the conclusion seems rushed compared even to Chainsaw Man level of fast storytelling. Overall, I have to say I really like Chainsaw Man and hope that part 2 will continue to be this good and interesting, and hopefully the anime can do its manga justice. If you're still watching, I just wanted to say thank you for sticking around for so long and have a great rest of the day.